Dear listeners, I ask you to listen to the story until the very end and be sure to write a review about what you liked and what needs to be changed to make it more interesting for you to listen to my stories.
The deadline. The house was old, the kind that breathed in the night, shifting and sighing like something alive. The air inside smelled of dust and wood, a mixture of history and neglect. Anna and I had been looking for a place to settle, something with character, something away from the noise of the city. We thought we'd found it in this two-story colonial on the edge of town, surrounded by tall trees that whispered when the wind ran through them. It was perfect. Or, at least, it had seemed that way. We had been here for only 3 days when we found the phone. It was built into the wall in the hallway just outside our bedroom. A relic of the past, its rotary dial covered in a thin layer of grime, the earpiece heavy in my hand when I lifted it. No dial tone. No wires connected. It was nothing more than a decoration, or so I thought. That first night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house settling. The wind outside howled against the glass, and the branches of the oak tree outside scraped at the second-floor windows like skeletal fingers. Anna was already asleep beside me, her breathing soft and rhythmic. I had just started to drift off when I heard it. The sharp, metallic ring of a telephone. I bolted upright, my skin prickling. The sound was unmistakable, an old-fashioned rotary phone, the kind that belonged in movies from the 50s. My first thought was that it must be coming from the TV downstairs, except we hadn't set up the TV yet. My eyes darted to the hallway, to the wall-mounted phone we had found earlier. The ringing was coming from there. I sat frozen, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. It wasn't possible. The damn thing wasn't even plugged in. And yet, it rang. I nudged Anna, but she just grumbled and turned over, pulling the blanket tighter around her. I was on my own. Slowly, I swung my legs out of bed and stepped onto the cold hardwood floor. Each step toward the hallway felt heavier, like wading through invisible water. The phone continued its eerie chime, a sound too crisp, too real. My fingers trembled as I reached out and lifted the receiver. Silence. Not even the faint hum of static. Just an absence, a void that stretched on too long. Then, just as I was about to hang up, I heard it. A whisper, soft, urgent. "Take me out of here." A chill ran down my spine. The voice was small, distant, like a child whispering into the dark. My grip tightened on the receiver. "Who is this?" I whispered back, my own voice barely more than breath. Silence. Then the line went dead. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring at the phone in my hand. The weight of it seemed heavier now, wrong somehow. I gently placed the receiver back on the cradle and turned back to the bedroom, my mind racing. Maybe it was a prank. Some kind of weird interference. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, Anna was already up, making coffee in the kitchen, oblivious to the events of the night before. Sunlight streamed through the windows, cutting across the wooden floors in golden beams. For a moment, the house seemed normal. Safe. Then I saw it. In the backyard, near the old oak tree, the soil had been disturbed. A patch of dirt, darker than the rest, slightly sunken, as if something had recently been buried there. A knot formed in my stomach as I stepped outside, the morning air crisp and biting against my skin. The ground felt soft beneath my feet, like it had been freshly turned. I crouched down and ran my fingers through the dirt. Something was there. Something small. I dug with my hands, the soil cold and damp. And then, I saw it. A tiny leather shoe, old and worn, half rotted from time. A child's shoe. I dropped it like it burned me, stumbling back. My breath came in short gasps as I stared at the thing, the whisper from the phone still echoing in my ears. "Take me out of here." The phone rang again. We found the phone on the very first day, a clunky relic bolted into the wall of the hallway, just between the kitchen and the living room. It was the old rotary kind, the beige plastic now yellowed with time, the numbers barely visible under a layer of grime. The cord, once coiled tightly, hung limply, curling like a dead snake onto the floor. The oddest thing? There was no outlet for it to be connected to. No phone jack, no wires running behind the plaster, nothing. It was just there, stuck to the wall, a silent observer of whatever had happened in this house before we arrived. At first, we laughed about it. Maybe it's an art piece, I joked, tracing my finger along the dusty dial. Claire wrinkled her nose, already annoyed with the mess the previous owners had left behind. The house was cheap, suspiciously cheap for its size, but the state of it explained a lot. It smelled stale, like something had been sealed up too long, forgotten. The wallpaper in some rooms was peeling in long, jagged strips, revealing layers of different decades beneath. The wooden floor creaked in that way old floors do, like they remember every footstep that's ever walked across them. It should have felt cozy, but there was something off, something I couldn't put my finger on. By the second night, we started hearing it. A soft ringing, distant, almost like it was coming from inside the walls. Claire thought it was a neighbor's phone, but it was too clear, too close. It had a crispness to it, like the sound was meant just for us. I tried to ignore it at first, dismissing it as old pipes or something shifting in the house, but then it happened while I was standing right next to the phone. The rotary dial trembled slightly, and the receiver twitched in its cradle as if some invisible hand was lifting it. And then, re-ringing. I froze. Claire was in the other room, humming to herself, unpacking dishes, oblivious. My pulse thumped against my throat as I reached out, hesitated, then grabbed the receiver. Static buzzed on the other end, deep and low, like the sound of a television tuned to a dead channel. I almost hung up, but then something else came through. A whisper. "Take me away from here." My fingers clenched around the phone. The voice was soft, childlike, but distorted, like it was being dragged through water. The words were barely audible, like they had to fight their way through the static just to reach me. I felt my skin go cold. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. Then, before I could say anything, the line clicked, and the buzzing stopped. The dial tone returned. I slammed the receiver down and stepped back, my breath shaky. The room was silent again, the phone as lifeless as before, as if nothing had happened. That night, I told Claire about it, half expecting her to laugh it off or tell me I was hearing things. Instead, she just stared at me, her face pale, her hands gripping the edge of the kitchen counter. "I heard it too," she whispered. "Last night. I thought I was dreaming." Neither of us slept much after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the whisper replaying in my head, the pleading voice, the way the phone felt warm when I held it, like something had been breathing through the line. The next morning, Claire went outside to clear her head. We hadn't even started on the backyard yet, a wild mess of overgrown grass and forgotten flower beds. I was pouring coffee when I heard her scream. I ran out, my stomach already twisting, and found her standing by the oak tree in the back corner of the yard, her hand covering her mouth. She pointed at the ground, her eyes wide with something I couldn't place, fear, maybe, or recognition. A small, dirt-covered shoe lay half buried in the soil. It was old, leather cracked and peeling, the laces frayed, the kind of shoe a child would have worn decades ago. And next to it, the dirt had been disturbed, freshly turned over, as if something, or someone, had been trying to claw their way out. I stood there, staring at the shoe, my breath coming in short, uneven bursts. The ground beneath it was loose, darker than the rest of the yard, as if the earth had been disturbed recently. Claire took a step back, wiping her hands on her jeans like she had touched something toxic, her face twisted in something close to disgust, but edged with fear. Neither of us said a word for a long time. The wind stirred through the trees, rustling the brittle leaves, filling the silence with something that felt almost expectant, like the house itself was watching, waiting. "We need to call someone," Claire finally muttered, her voice shaking in a way I had never heard before. This isn't normal." I nodded, though my gut was twisting into knots. "Call who, exactly? The police? What would we even tell them? That we found an old child's shoe buried in the backyard of a house that had been sitting empty for years? That something had been calling us on a dead phone, whispering like it was trapped in some endless, static-filled limbo. They'd laugh us off, or worse, start asking questions we couldn't answer. Still, we couldn't just ignore it. I grabbed the small garden spade we had left near the porch and knelt down, scooping away some of the loose dirt with slow, cautious movements. Claire sucked in a breath behind me, but she didn't stop me. She wanted answers just as badly as I did, maybe even more. The soil crumbled easily, softer than I expected, like it had been dug up before, recently disturbed. The deeper I went, the more uneasy I felt. Then, after only a few inches, I hit something solid. It wasn't bone. It was metal. I cleared away more dirt, and slowly, something started to take shape beneath my hands. A rusted tin box, about the size of a shoebox, its edges eaten away by time and moisture. It had once been painted red, but most of the color had long since faded, leaving behind only patches of corroded metal. A lock, small and delicate, sat on the front, but the clasp had long since broken away. My fingers trembled slightly as I lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in a tattered cloth, was a collection of small objects. A tiny wooden horse, its paint chipped and peeling. A lock of blonde hair, tied with a thin blue ribbon. A pair of marbles, dull and scratched, like they had been rolled across rough pavement too many times. A Polaroid photograph, edges curled, the image inside faded to near oblivion. I pulled it out, holding it up to the weak morning light, and felt my stomach lurch. A little boy stood in front of the very same oak tree, his small face blurred with age, his clothes old-fashioned, the kind children wore in the 70s or 80s. He was holding something in his hands, something just barely visible at the bottom of the frame. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what it was. A rotary phone. Not just any rotary phone. Our rotary phone. The exact same beige plastic, the same coiled cord, the same worn numbers. It sat in the child's hands like a lifeline, like something he couldn't let go of, something he had carried with him even in death. Claire let out a soft, broken sound beside me. She had seen it too. I didn't want to say it. I didn't want to admit what this meant, what it was leading to, but the words slipped out before I could stop them. He's still here. The moment I spoke, the air around us shifted, thickened, changed. A sudden, piercing ring cut through the silence, echoing from inside the house, loud and insistent. The phone was ringing. The dead phone was ringing. And this time, I knew exactly who was on the other end. Claire flinched at the sound, her hands instinctively flying up to her ears as if she could block it out, but we both knew that wasn't possible. It wasn't just a noise, it was a presence, something that slithered into the air and curled around our lungs, thick and suffocating. The call wasn't for just anyone. It was for us. It had always been for us. The discovery of the box, the Polaroid, the tiny, brittle remnants of a life long gone, it had all been leading here, to this moment. I turned toward the house, my feet moving before my mind could tell them not to. The ringing drilled into my skull, growing louder, more insistent, as if whatever was on the other end knew we had finally seen the truth, as if it could sense that we had peeled back the last fragile layer between its world and ours. Claire grabbed my arm, her grip digging in hard enough to bruise, her breath coming in sharp, ragged bursts. I could feel her shaking, but she wasn't stopping me. The front door creaked open at the lightest push, as if the house had been waiting, holding its breath. The shadows inside stretched long and deep, twisting in ways that didn't quite make sense, like they were folding in on themselves, shifting when I wasn't looking directly at them. The phone sat where we had left it, the receiver trembling slightly with each shrill, endless ring. The air around it shimmered, warped, as if reality itself was buckling under the weight of whatever had been trapped inside that static-filled abyss for so long. I reached out, fingers hovering just above the receiver, my skin prickling with the electric charge of something unseen, something old and hungry. Every part of my body screamed at me to stop, to turn around and run, but it was too late for that. We had already opened the door. We had already invited it in. I lifted the receiver, pressed it to my ear. The ringing stopped. For a moment, there was nothing. Just a hollow silence, so deep and consuming that it felt like standing on the edge of an endless void, staring down into something that had no bottom. Then, beneath the static, something shifted. A breath. A whisper. "You found it." The voice was small, fragile, like a child's, but distorted, stretched at the edges like an old cassette tape that had been played too many times. It sent ice skittering down my spine, my fingers tightening around the receiver as if it might slip away. "Who are you?" My voice came out hoarse, barely more than a whisper. A long pause. A crackle of static, then a sound that I could only describe as smiling, the ghost of a laugh caught between dimensions. "You already know." The box. The photograph. The little boy with the phone. A sickening realization crawled through my gut, cold and inevitable. He wasn't just calling us. He was waiting for us. And now, we had answered. Claire's breath hitched behind me, a sharp, almost wounded sound, as if she too had begun to understand. I wanted to turn around, to meet her eyes, to confirm that we were thinking the same terrible thought, but I couldn't move. The voice on the other end of the line had anchored me in place, a tether of cold, invisible fingers wrapped around my throat. The weight of the receiver in my hand had shifted, too. What had once been a simple plastic shell now felt heavier, almost damp, as if it had absorbed something from the voice, something that was seeping through my skin. The static deepened, thickened, pressing in on my eardrum like the pressure of deep water. The boy, if that's what he had ever been, hadn't spoken again, but I could hear something beneath the crackle. A rustling. A movement, like small feet scraping against the floor. No, not feet. Hands. Crawling, dragging. I swallowed hard, the air in the house suddenly thick with the scent of damp earth, old and sour, like the freshly overturned soil in the garden. My mind snapped back to the tiny, half-buried shoe. I imagined another, a match to the first, still attached to something small and stiff beneath the roots, locked away in the grasp of time. The phone let out another breath of static, and then the voice returned, closer, clearer. "You can let me out." A sudden gust of wind slammed against the house, rattling the windows in their frames. Claire let out a startled gasp, and I finally turned, the phone still pressed against my ear. Her face was pale, her lips slightly parted, but her eyes were locked on something behind me. I didn't want to look. Every instinct in my body screamed at me not to turn around, to drop the receiver, to get the hell out of this house and never come back. But something much deeper, something ancient and irresistible, forced my body to move. Slowly, I turned. The hallway leading to the bedrooms stretched before me, longer than it should have been, its walls bending slightly inward as if the house itself was breathing. The air shimmered, a heat mirage in the dim light, and then, just at the edge of the shadows, something moved. Small fingers curled around the doorframe, pale and brittle like dried twigs. Then another hand, and another. A head emerged, but not in any way that made sense. It peeled itself out of the darkness, unfolding like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. The skin was paper-thin, translucent in places, stretched too tightly over bones that jutted at odd angles. The eyes, if they had ever been eyes, were nothing more than deep, empty sockets, blacker than the spaces between the stars. But the mouth was smiling. Claire let out a strangled sob, her back hitting the far wall as she tried to push herself away, her hands scrabbling uselessly against the peeling wallpaper. My fingers clenched around the receiver, the plastic casing groaning under the pressure, but I couldn't let go. The thing in the hallway tilted its head, its empty gaze locked onto me, and then the voice on the phone whispered something I couldn't understand, a word that slid beneath my skin like a needle threading its way into my spine. The thing in the hallway twitched. Then, with a grotesque, jerking movement, it took a step forward. The phone crackled one last time, and the voice whispered, almost tenderly, "I'm coming home." And then the line went dead. I barely slept all night. The bedroom light was on, and Laura didn't seem to notice that something was wrong with me. She fell asleep almost immediately, and honestly, I was a little jealous. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to every little sound in the house. but the night was unnervingly silent. No usual creaks of the wooden panels, no wind rattling the windows. Just a suffocating vacuum that made my mind work even harder. Every now and then, my gaze drifted to the wall where that damned phone hung. It was silent, of course, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the moment I closed my eyes, it would ring again. I woke up when daylight was already filtering through the window. My head throbbed from exhaustion. Laura was still asleep, so I quietly got up, threw on a t-shirt, and stepped outside. The air was fresh and damp, and I took a deep breath, trying to clear my head. But after just a few steps into the yard, I noticed something strange. The ground near the back entrance looked disturbed, as if someone had recently dug there. I didn't remember any digging, let alone burying anything. I moved closer, crouched down, and saw something small and dark peeking through the soil. Digging with my hands, I pulled it free. A child's shoe, old, dirty, with cracked leather, as if it had been buried for decades. My heart slammed so hard against my ribs that I had to steady myself on one knee. This was bad. Really bad. The shoe was too small for any of the neighbor kids, and inside, there were traces of something dark, almost black. I didn't want to think about what it was, but an ugly suspicion was already forming in my mind. Rising to my feet, I took a few unsteady steps back, still clutching the shoe. This wasn't a coincidence. "What are you doing?" Laura's voice made me jump. She was standing in the doorway, blinking sleepily, but when her eyes landed on the shoe in my hands, her expression darkened immediately. "Where did you get that?" I didn't know what to say. I just silently held it out to her. She took it hesitantly, as if afraid to touch it, and studied it for a long time until her fingers brushed against something inside. She recoiled, dropping the shoe. It hit the ground with a dull thud. "We need to leave," she said quietly. For the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. We packed in less than an hour. Laura didn't argue, didn't ask questions, just moved with the same urgency I felt. Something about this whole thing was deeply wrong. I could feel it in every fiber of my being. But as we were carrying boxes to the car, the phone inside the house started ringing. The sound hit me like a knife to the chest. Laura froze, her eyes wide. "Ignore it," I whispered. But it didn't stop. The ringing kept coming, slicing through the silence over and over. I had to answer. I had to. I took a step toward the door, as if in a trance. "Don't you dare!" Laura gasped, but I was already inside. My fingers trembled as I lifted the receiver to my ear. "Take me away from here," a weak child's voice whispered. My blood turned to ice. "Who are you?" I croaked, but in that moment, the voice changed. It was no longer a child's. It was mine. "Don't leave." My heart slammed so hard against my ribs that I dropped the receiver. It hit the floor with a hollow clatter, but the sound on the other end didn't stop. A hum. Low, deep, as if a storm was raging underground. I bolted for the door. Laura was already behind the wheel. I jumped into the car, and without a word, she hit the gas. We never went back to that house. I tried to dig up information, archives, old newspapers, the history of the place, but I found nothing. No records of missing children, no reports of crimes. But every night, as I fall asleep, I hear the ringing. Distant, faint, calling from a darkness I cannot see but know is waiting for me. And I know that one day, I'll wake up. And the phone will be there. Ringing. And this time, I won't be able to ignore it.